British Prime Minister Tony Blair has been one of America's strongest allies in the war on terror and ultimately in the war with Iraq. His support has brought him both praise and criticism, especially at home and within his own party. Joining me now is Philip Stevens, Associate Editor of the Financial Times. His new book is Tony Blair, a biography. He has followed the Prime Minister's career for more than 20 years. He has had many meetings and interviews with him, and he has a distinguished career in journalism. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Tell me two things. One, what has this support of the war, which clearly is heartfelt by Tony Blair, he clearly believes in it, or he wouldn't have taken the political risk that he has taken if it wasn't a matter of faith with him. What has it done to him, both politically and personally, and what toll do you think it's taken on him?
Well, politically, it's been fairly damaging. As you said, there are a number of people in his own party who were very against the war at the beginning, and now that no weapons of mass destruction have been found, are criticizing the Prime Minister even more. And within Britain as a whole, the population was very divided on the war, but, you know, on balance, I would say, was against. So there's been a fairly high political cost. On the other hand, I think it's, in a strange way, it sort of brought out the real sort of conviction politician in Tony Blair. Early in his career, during his first years as Prime Minister, he seemed to be one of those politicians who was always following the opinion polls, who was checking the focus groups, was worried about the next morning's headlines.
A bit too glib.
A bit too glib, he borrowed a lot of the techniques from Bill Clinton, right, the sort of New Democrat techniques. I think what we've seen now is a politician who's decided, well, what counts is my place in history, so I've got to do the right thing. And he was very, very firmly of the belief that going to war against Iraq was the right thing to do.
Why did he believe it was the right thing to do?
I think for two reasons. One, he took the same view as a lot of Americans about the meaning of September the 11th, 2001, and that meaning was that there was a real threat to the West from these two things, the development of weapons of mass destruction in certain states and this sort of international terrorism and the danger that the two would come together. One of his favorite phrases is that September the 11th changed the psychology of America, but it should have changed the psychology of the world. Yeah. So he, I think, took that judgment. He also took a strategic judgment, which he was very concerned, and he said this to me a couple of weeks after September the 11th, he was very concerned that America, in his words, would jump out of the international system, that in response to that terrible terrorist attack, America would say, well, look, we can't have doing with NATO and all these other things. We've got to deal with this.
We've got to get on with it.
We've got to get on with it. And so I think he saw his role, where he's only been partially successful, I mean, not entirely at all successful, as holding America in the international system and trying to bring other European countries closer to America.
What does he think of Bush?
What he says about Bush is that he's an extremely straight politician. And in the book, I quote him as saying that, you know, Bush is one of those politicians who says what he means and does what he says.
This is a Margaret Thatcher-like politician.
Yeah, and that in all his relationships with Bush, he's found him entirely straight, fairly clear-sighted. I mean, a lot of people in Britain see the president as rather a sort of bumbling figure. Blair's take, and indeed that of his officials, is that in private, in their discussions, the president is very clear about what he wants to do, and when he makes a commitment, he sticks to it.
So in private, Tony Blair with Jack Straw and others, Alistair MacLean perhaps, is strongly, you don't hear a word of dissent about Bush.
No, I mean, I think there are
criticism or contempt, or he's not very bright, or he's not very good, or he's not very articulate, or he doesn't know what he's doing, or he doesn't respect, you know,
no, I think
international rules.
On occasion, you hear words of frustration that President Bush, for example, on the Middle East peace process, Tony Blair has pushed very hard for the president to take a more engaged, more active role. So you hear words of frustration when, you know, it seems, certainly to a number of Europeans, that the president stands back. But you do hear from some Labour politicians, and early on in the presidency, you actually, in private, it was heard from Tony Blair's wife, Cherie Blair, this sense of well, what are we doing dealing with a Republican?
Yeah.
But the Prime Minister is one of these politicians who says, you know, you deal with leaders as they are, and you don't sort of...
A relationship with America, not a party.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does he take, was part of this notion that the Atlantic Alliance was crucial and that you ought not join with America, you ought not fail to join with America unless you had an overwhelming reason?
Yes, and I think on two levels. One, for Britain, the so-called special relationship is very important to our foreign policy. It has been for the last 50 years. It's the way that we think, perhaps we're wrong, but we exercise influence in the world. So on that narrow sort of strategic judgment, any British Prime Minister, I think, would have said, look, you don't step aside from the US unless you have a really strong reason. And then on the broader reason, I think Blair, who wants Britain to be a more European country as well, took the judgment, if I sort of stand close to the president, I can try, and this is where he wasn't really successful, but I can try and bring the rest of Europe with me.
What's his relationship with Chirac? Back to Bush in a moment.
His relationship with Jacques Chirac was very bad during the crisis before the Iraq War. And it became very personal. It wasn't just a disagreement about Iraq. And one of the things I say in the book is that Blair was getting intelligence reports about Chirac's motives, and they were, it seems, were saying that, look, the French president doesn't like this upstart British Prime Minister thinking he can, you know, run things. France runs Europe. So Chirac was actually out personally to sort of, if not destroy Blair, certainly to damage him significantly as a political leader within Europe.
Now, Tony Blair heard that. Did he believe it?
He believed it,
And do you believe it was true?
I believe it was true.
Chirac was out to destroy the political leadership of Tony Blair, especially as it concerned Europe.
Yes, I think it was true. And I think Chirac had decided, he had just been re-elected, and he'd gone through a bad patch, and I think he decided that it was important to reassert France's traditional leadership in Europe.
I've had other British journalists and British authors come here and sit at the table and say that, and I'd ask them about the difference in Clinton and Blair, Blair, Clinton, Blair, Bush. And they made the following point, and I'm interested if you concur or disagree, that Blair has said that he liked about Bush that he was decisive. You'd have a meeting with him, he'd say he was going to do something, and the next day he would do it. Whereas with Clinton, it would sort of end up in a series of meetings and it would sort of not necessarily get done.
I think there's something in that. I mean, the relationship with Clinton is still very strong. When Bill Clinton goes to England now, he actually stays...
He's at 10 Downing.
He stays at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country house. And they're political soulmates, and people say that they'll sit up, you know, half the night talking politics. But I think there was, particularly in Clinton's second term, there were frustrations about the president, the domestic distractions. And over, say, the war in Kosovo, where Blair again showed his determination to sort of, we as the West have got to go out and solve this problem. There were many difficult moments, I think, where Blair thought Clinton was being indecisive, was watching the polls too keenly back in America. So there was a tension, but I wouldn't want to push it that far.
Cheney got headlines. What you say in this book about Cheney created some headlines in your paper, certainly, and in other places too, saying that Cheney frustrated Blair because he was not enthusiastic and in fact may have been an impediment to going to the United Nations.
Yes, I think more than not enthusiastic, very much against. And Blair, in that period of September of 2002, was basically saying to Bush, look, if it comes to war, I'm going to be with you, but we have to do this properly, and doing this properly means going to the United Nations and trying to get another resolution. He arrived at Camp David to find, for a meeting at the beginning of that September with the president, to find Cheney there. They hadn't been told in advance that was going to happen. And at that meeting, and in the days and weeks beyond, British officials found that Cheney was trying to undermine agreements that the Prime Minister felt at least he felt, had reached with the President. For example, the President agreed that they would seek another resolution in the Prime Minister's
Mainly
view.
because the Prime Minister wanted it.
Well, I think there were people in the administration here. I wouldn't want to overemphasize Blair's influence. I think Colin Powell, for example, was pressing on the same door, as it were. But Cheney, for example, was still saying, even before the president, up to the moment the president gave his UN speech, saying, oh no, we'll go back to the United Nations, but we don't need another resolution. We're not going to get enmeshed and tied up in all this UN stuff. And the view that Blair and others took was essentially that Cheney is a visceral unilateralist. He doesn't want to get messed up with all this international stuff, international law and institutions, etc.
The idea, Tony Blair has, as you suggested, articulated a memory and sense of the consequences of 9/11 more than most American politicians, including the president. I mean, he's been more eloquent than most American politicians about remembering 9/11 and the consequences of 9/11 and how 9/11 changed everything. I mean, it seems to have burned into his heart or brain or something.
Yeah, I think he was profoundly affected. It doesn't mean, I think, that he has the same view necessarily as the president on what should eventually come out of it. He, during the Kosovo War, developed this theory of sort of what he called humanitarian intervention then, but it was sort of robust intervention. But he sees the interdependence of the world. He sees the world getting smaller, and he sees the need for the international community, led by America, but not bullied by America, sees that need for the international community to sort of pull together and act as one. And he feels that very, very strongly. It's sort of right at the core of his sort of political beliefs.
He also feels very strongly that the combination of terrorist and nuclear and weapons of mass destruction is a lethal force that the West cannot allow to happen.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, there are, if you listen to British intelligence, we obviously have to be careful now about how much we believe, but, you know, they're saying to the Prime Minister the possibility of a major terrorist attack with something perhaps like a dirty bomb or with some biological agent in London or another European city in the next 5 years is very high. And
that's what British intelligence is telling Tony Blair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very high.
Yeah.
Either a dirty bomb
or some biological agent or something like that. Yeah. The possibility.
Blair believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Yeah, he did.
And was he and to find none has meant what to him?
I think it's meant, on the one side, huge disappointment because it's created enormous political difficulties for him. And there is a big question, well, why, if, you know, my intelligence people were telling me this year in, year out from the moment I became Prime Minister, and this intelligence, you know, predates 9/11, you know, sort of, you know, from 1997 onwards he was getting this, and the previous administration, the Conservative administration, was getting it. So there is a sort of question, what's going on? But on another level, he's completely unapologetic because his reasoning for war was a strategic one, which was really, if we don't deal with this guy who has defied the international community for all these years, for a decade, who won't even now meet UN resolutions, then we're not going to have any chance at all facing down other rogue states and, you know, and risking sort of terrorists.
If we let Saddam stand, we will be less able to take out others.
Yeah, I think he felt actually unable to take out others because if the international community couldn't stand up to this person who, you know, defied, broken every resolution that had been passed by the UN, what hope did it have with dealing with, you know, Libya, for example, or North Korea, which is going to be even more difficult?
George Bush has said that even if there were no weapons of mass destruction, this was a war worth fighting. Does Tony Blair believe that in based context of what you just said?
Yes, he does, absolutely. And he said it, and he's, interestingly, he's sort of, I watched the president on Meet the Press this weekend, and the week before I saw Tony Blair appear answering questions before a parliamentary committee about the very same subject. He was sort of grilled for an hour or so on the subject. And my impression, and I don't want to be too pro sort of Prime Minister or pro-British, was that Blair was much more on the front foot. I mean, he went in there and said, look, whatever you think about the intelligence, and we'll investigate all that, don't expect me to apologize. It was the right thing to do. Iraq.
Weapons of mass destruction or not.
Or not.
He was a bad guy.
He was
who
a bad
done bad
guy.
things, and we know at one point he had weapons of mass destruction.
And if we'd not dealt with him, he would have developed them again. And by the way, he was actually killing his own people in large numbers every year. And so nothing will move him. Privately, publicly, he's utterly convinced that it was the right thing to do.
Will he survive politically?
I think he will. I don't think he's going to be Prime Minister forever. He's been Prime Minister for 6.5, coming on 7 years now. I think he's probably said to himself, I'll do another 2 or 3 years. I think he wants to fight another election, probably in the middle of next year, and then bow out after perhaps 9 years. Margaret Thatcher he's very conscious of Margaret Thatcher overstaying her welcome. She stayed for 11 years and then was forced out. So I think Which
I don't think she's ever...
she's never recovered from.
Well, or accepted the fact that she should have bowed out.
Yeah. Well, I think he's quite conscious, although he's a young man. He's only 50, so we have to wonder what he'll do next. But, I mean, there have been moments in the last month or so when there's been a lot of speculation about whether he could survive through to the next election. You've got to allow for events. Another British Prime Minister talked about politics being driven by events, so you have to allow for that possibility. But other things being equal, I think he's pretty determined to stay on for another 2 or 3 years. He's got some domestic policy things he wants to do, and he wants to try and rebuild relationships in Europe.
He also has benefited from weak conservative opposition. There's not been a strong leader opposing him.
No, I mean, the Conservative Party had a sort of collective nervous breakdown after getting rid of Margaret Thatcher,
Well,
and it hasn't. I mean, it was in government for a while afterwards, but it's never really recovered. It had two sort of, I would say, rather brutally dud leaders in the last 5 years. It's recently got a new leader, Michael Howard.
Seems to be the best of the bunch.
Who's a serious politician.
Yeah.
He's a big guy in politics. Yeah. You watch him with Tony Blair in the House of Commons in their weekly duels, and he holds his own and sometimes bests the Prime Minister. On the other hand, I don't think the Tory party has yet woken up to the idea that it's got to change its character, its shape, its tone, if it's going to win back. I mean, Blair, whether you like him or not, has sort of reshaped the landscape of British politics. He's pushed the Labour Party into the centre, occupied a lot of ground that the Conservatives used to occupy. And the Conservatives have made the fatal mistake of moving further out to the right and allowing themselves to be pushed right out onto the sidelines. And they've got to come back in with alternative policies before they win another election.
Two last questions. I meant to bring this up. I think Dick Cheney, Press Secretary Kevin Kellums, said that the Vice President is a great admirer of Blair. This is in response to your book. You've heard this before. And that the biography, quote, sounds like a very creative attempt to sell fiction as a non-fiction book. Kellum says the account is, quote, without foundation.
Well, all I can say is, in researching this book, and it's not an authorized biography, but I did talk to the Prime Minister, and I did talk to all the serious people, and I put in the front of the book the sort of rules I used, and I only talked about what happened at a meeting if I spoke to someone who was at the meeting, or if I spoke to someone who saw the account of the meeting. But you
have a two-source rule or one-source rule?
I have a two-source rule on things like that.
So in other words, you can't just take one person to the meeting. You have to have two people tell you this is what happened in the meeting. The book is called Tony Blair, biography by Philip Stevens, The Making of a World Leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. We'll be right back. Stay with us. The media's influence in education of young people in the Middle East especially plays a crucial role in the peace process. Itamar Marcus is a founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch, an Israeli organization that monitors the Palestinian media. Ziad Asali joins me from Washington. He is the president and founder of the American Task Force on Palestine. I am pleased to welcome both of them to this broadcast and to have a dialogue about what is, in fact, crucial. Tom Friedman, in a New York Times piece, said the following. This was January 1804. The explosion of Arab multimedia from Al Jazeera to the Internet. What's happening is that this Arab media explosion is feeding the images of this Israeli-Palestinian violence to this Arab population explosion. radicalizing in it and melding in the heads of young Arabs and Muslims the notion that the biggest threat to the future is JIA, Jews, Israel, and America. That speaks to a different point, but in some ways a similar point about the power of media, and we want to talk about that and different views on that. Tell me how you came to this and what your point is, Mr. Marcus.
Well, Palestinian Media Watch was formed about 6 years ago to get an understanding of what the Palestinians were saying amongst themselves in Arabic. And very quickly we found that there were two distinct worlds. There was the English language world, which was for media consumption, and there was the Arabic language world, which was completely different. And we were following especially what was being said to children, how children were being educated, because we feel that for long-term peace, it's more important to know what a third-grade teacher is telling her students than what Yasser Arafat is telling George Bush. Because ultimately, that's going to make the difference of how the next generation relates to Israel as neighbors or not.
And what, in your judgment, are they saying to the children in Palestinian areas?
We have found a consistent message that the conflict with Israel is not a border conflict. The conflict with Israel, the children are taught, the adults are taught, is an existential conflict against two targets. One, against individual Jews who are constantly portrayed as evil, conniving, cunning, as inherently evil. And the second thing is that Israel is delegitimized in its creation, not with relation to what's called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but in its creation, Israel is delegitimized as an existing state. So the children are taught that the conflict with Israel is existential against Jews and against Israel as a state.
And what are Israeli children taught about Palestinian issues, Palestinian people, Palestinian objectives?
Israeli children are actually taught diametrically opposed messages. There is very active peace education in Israeli schools and Israeli society. I'll just give you one example of beautiful peace education in an Israeli school book. There's a story in, I think it's a third-grade book, of an Israeli boy who's at the water and he falls into the water and he's drowning. And he can't get out of the water. And he assumes he's going to die, and then all of a sudden a rowboat comes along with an Arab in it. The Arab's wearing a keffiyeh, and then you have this illustration of an Arab with a keffiyeh bending in the water and saving this Israeli child. Now that's beautiful peace education. It's telling the Israeli child, Arabs are good, and if you're in trouble, the Arab's actually going to save your life.
So all of the Israeli media, most of it, I mean obviously you can't say 100%, but most of the Israeli media you find is not showing in any way insensitive, disrespectful, erroneous about Palestinians and Palestinian objectives.
That is correct.
And what they're teaching children.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually studied over 400 Israeli school books, and every little example of slight stereotyping we publicized said these should be corrected. This is after we studied the Palestinian school books and found horrific hatred of Jews, hatred of Israel, calls for Israel's destruction. Jews defined as treacherous and evil, the enemies of God, the enemies of the prophets. This was Palestinian school books. The Israeli school books are completely the opposite, that in spite of the conflict, we're educating to see the Arabs as our potential neighbors. I'll just point out one further example. The Palestinian media has been, to children, not so much specifically this, but has been calling for the extermination of Jews, essentially, over the last few years by numerous religious leaders who have explicitly said, kill the Jews wherever you find them, have no mercy in your heart. They've also indicated that this is what Islam is indicating, is demanding of them in many sources, and many occasions on Palestinian television. This is to the extent that the incitement has gone, literally calling for the murder of Jews as something that God wants of them. Israelis, on the other side, just as a way of comparison, there was a young woman named Tatiana Suskind who after a suicide bombing in Israel, was incensed and drew a picture of a picture of what she called Muhammad, a pig, and the Quran on a piece of paper, and started distributing this in the streets of Israel. This was brought to the press's attention in outrage, and it was publicized. The woman was arrested, charged under Israel's anti-incitement laws, and actually was convicted and sat a year in jail for insulting another religion. So Israel abhors an inciter against an Arab because he's an Arab, and the Palestinian Society and the media has been promoting it as Palestinian Authority policy.
All right, let me go to Ziad Asali. He is a physician. He is he's the president and the founder of the American Task Force on Palestine, and he joins us from Washington. He and Mr. Marcus testified before the Education Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee in the United States Congress. You just heard what Mr. Marcus said. Tell me how you see this.
Well, as someone who's pretty much dedicating all my energies and organizationally and personally to pursue a peaceful solution with two-state solutions side by side, living in peace and giving hope for the future generations, I find it rather distressing to listen to such an incredibly one-sided portrayal of two societies, two communities, and their educational systems. It is unquestionably true that there are bad apples on every side, and statements and pictures and all kinds of unpleasant things exist on the Palestinian and Israeli side, and it is in our own fundamental interest, if we are serious about peace, to not overplay the negative and damaging images and gloss over all the positive attempts of reconstructing a future for the children. I know that the Palestinian curricula have been reviewed under the supervision of the Europeans, and this has been going on since 1994. Most of the stuff that have been mentioned, of course, were applied to the area prior to 1994 when the Palestinians moved in after the Oslo Agreement and then started their work on education. Prior to that, the kids were educated under Jordanian textbooks, and everything that was mentioned now applies to the area before the Palestinians even took command. And Professor Nathan Brown, who is a good, solid professor at George Washington University, has reviewed this work extensively. I happen to know him, have a great respect for him, and he indicated in writing and did the most credible work on this subject and said that the new curricula seem to be acceptable and do a good foundation for the peace.
Mr. Marcus.
If I could respond, the comments that I'm talking about and the quotes, the things I was citing were not from the past. And just to go on, I mean, the quotes about calling for the destruction and murder of Jews, there's things on Palestinian television happening over the last couple of years and have nothing to do with Jordanian school books. And this has been a backbone, not only to adults, but children have been taught through the last 3 years, through music videos on Palestinian television, to aspire death for Allah, to aspire the Shahada. I mean, just give you one example. There was a music video that was probably on PATV 500 times. So this is not taking something... PATV, Palestinian Authority official television.
Right.
Now, on this music video, which again, 500 times directed at children, a young boy, probably 14 years old, writes a farewell letter to his parents, and then he goes off hoping to die in the conflict. And the words of his letter, which are sung to us by a popular singer, include the words, "How sweet is martyrdom," as he's falling to the ground having achieved the Shahada. How sweet is martyrdom. He falls to the ground dead. He turns to his mother in the letter, "Mother, be joyous over my blood." We have found numerous music videos where Palestinian children are told that Shahada is sweet. We have had children on television saying, 11-year-old girls saying on television that they want to die for Allah because the afterlife is so wonderful and that Shahada is sweet. And let me just give you one more example. There's a story of a 14-year-old boy named Faras Uda who, according to the official Palestinian Daily, went out hoping to die. He prepared a memorial for himself in the corner of his room with his picture and a wreath around it. And as he left the house, he said to his mother, "Don't worry, mother, Shahada is sweet." He went out, put himself in the front lines, hoping to die, was hit in some crossfire. No one knows which bullet did it. The point is, this boy had been so convinced by today's Palestinian media, by the thousands of hours of convincing children that they should be dying for Allah as shaheeds, he went out and succeeded in doing this. And because of this, he was turned into a Palestinian Authority hero on Palestinian television.
Dr. Asali?
Yes. There is no denying at all that there are people who are committing suicide as they inflict damage on others. This is what we call suicide bombings. They have motivations. They have their own sense of what it is that they're doing in this life. I condemn them myself and my organization with no equivocation. However, I want to say that detaching the daily life, the context, the contextual life under occupation, and blaming the whole thing on media is an unacceptable simplification, unfortunately. These people live with an abhorrent reality. They live under house arrest quite often. They have to deal with checkpoints, and they have to deal with bombs coming from the sky and from tanks. They have to deal with daily humiliation, deprivation, malnutrition, and school closures, city closures. These are realities. These are realities that elicit reactions from these young men and women. And part of the impact is of education, but it's hardly the whole story.
If I may just comment on that, I feel tremendous sympathy for the Palestinians who have to wait at checkpoints and for the difficult conditions that the Palestinians have today in the cities. However, we must ask who is ultimately responsible for these checkpoints and who's responsible for the suffering. Before there was terrorism, there wasn't a checkpoint. Before there was terrorism, everything in the economic situation of the Palestinians was flourishing. In fact, under Israel, before the Oslo Accords, under Israel, the Palestinian areas, that is the West Bank, had one of the fastest growing economies in the world under Israel. In the 70s, for example, the the West Bank economy grew at 10% a year, was the fourth fastest growing economy in the world, and this was under Israel. When Israel got the West Bank administration in '67, there were no universities. When Israel gave it over, there were 7 universities. All of the good things that people want for Palestinians are exactly what Israelis have wanted for Palestinians, with one difference. The rest of the world has talked about it, and Israel has done these things. Israel did everything to improve the lives of these people because we wanted them to be neighbors, to live with us in peace. When the Palestinian Authority was established in 1993, they are the ones who turned the situation around. They're the ones who encouraged the terrorism, fighting the peace process in Arabic, and they are the ones who brought the checkpoints. They're the ones who brought all of this suffering on their people. So yes, I sympathize with the suffering of the Palestinian children and their people, but who is responsible? Not Israel, only the Palestinian leadership.
Well, if I may say so, Palestinians are living under occupation. Remove the occupations and there'll be no suicide bombings. I mean, if you want to simplify things to their maximum and simplistic formation. But let us be serious. People who live under occupation would want one thing above all. They want liberty. And, it is not altogether shocking for someone to say, give me liberty or give me death. People do want to be free. The Palestinians have lived under occupation, the longest standing occupation of our present times. Now, since 1967. They want to be free people, and if you give them freedom, the challenge for reasonable people on a show like this should be this: how do we actually, collectively and together, try and make these people live separately, independently, in freedom, so that they have normal relations with each other, rather than that to say it's the Israeli fault or the Palestinian fault. That's easy. That's much too easy. To feel a victim yourself, to be victimized and have a monopoly on victimization, if you will, and then the other guy, his grievance, his suffering, etc., is only a theoretical consideration for you. No, we want to build societies, new relations, for a state of Palestine, independent, viable, alongside Israel. That is how we should be spending our energies, rather than blaming each other.
If, in fact, the kind of images that are being presented, if, in fact, that he has put together in a documentary that they have done called Ask for Death, and then a new documentary, I suspect, that's called The Making of a Child Warrior, probably the same theme on those two, I would assume.
Yes.
These two documentaries are reflective of the kind of media, the kind of portrayal that young Arab children are seeing. Is that helpful in the process to achieve the objectives that you just so eloquently outlined?
Okay, it is completely not productive to that. But let us talk.
And so therefore, both sides should make sure that kind of inciting material
Yes.
Not in
sternly.
textbooks, not on the media.
Yes. Everywhere. Yes. And may I just ask about generalizations here? So I'm sure somebody, if they spend 6 years of their lives trying to compile things, they would find things like that, and they might even embellish them. I don't know. But if you take clips from the Jerry Springer show and show it in New Zealand about the American TV, then you would give them an incredibly distorted picture of American TV also. We have to be careful with the selective process here. I personally read the Palestinian press every day. I read other press in the region, and I don't see a thing, absolutely nothing, to suggest this in the print media. I don't live there, and I don't see what they have on TV, but I assume they have several TV stations and have several things. Dwelling on the complete negative stereotype of the other and demonizing him is completely unacceptable, whether by shows that are actually on TV or by commentary about what is happening in real life. Yeah. We have to live in the gray area. It's not black and white.
Okay, I think it's very important to understand that the items that we are showing and that we are documenting in these reports are not taken, these are not exceptions that appeared once over a period of years. When I tell you that that clip encouraging young children to shahada was on 500-600 times over a period of 2 years, it was sometimes on 2 and 3 times a day. This was the backbone of Palestinian television. When you say, for example, that you think the print media is fine, let me just tell you about an item or two that appeared in the last 2 days in the Palestinian print media. There was a discussion between two Palestinians. I forget the exact names now, but one of them was talking about Israel exchanging one Israeli captive for 400 terrorists, mostly from the Hezbollah, with the Hezbollah. And the other one responded and explained that Israel does this intentionally because it's trying to tell the world that the value of a Jew is worth more than the value of an Arab, and that even one Jew is worth 1,000 Arabs. And the other one responded and said, oh yes, this is found in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and this is their ideology. This was yesterday, 2 days ago on Palestinian television.
But let me ask you this. I mean, you're not suggesting that in the Israeli press, you won't find things that Palestinians would take great offense at, whether it is what somebody said, not talking about necessarily the editorial policy of a particular publication. I mean, there's some things that in certain Israeli publications, the government takes great, the Sharon government takes great exception to. But clearly in newspapers, on television programs like this and others, people say things that other people violently disagree with. Doesn't that happen in Israeli press as well?
It's true. The Israeli press is a completely democratic press.
And therefore people say things that are offensive to Palestinians.
Right, but the Palestinian press is not a democratic press. And Bassam Eid, for example, who's a Palestinian, has written and described tens of cases of Palestinian journalists who were tortured because they didn't follow the official PA line, the official Palestinian Authority line. So that things that are appearing on Palestinian television, things that are appearing in their official newspaper are not things that can happen. You have to imagine a state like Iraq in terms of totalitarian control of the press. This is what the PA is. When they repeatedly, and a few weeks ago there were other references to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that these messages keep coming over and over again, that the official religious leaders on television have called repeatedly for the extermination of Jews. This is not just that person's opinion. This is something that the Palestinian Authority leadership, now I believe sincerely that Ziad in Washington wants to have a peaceful two-state solution, but he doesn't really represent what the Palestinian Authority leadership is telling to their people, and that's what we have a problem with.
I certainly do not represent the Palestinian Authority, although what Mr. Marcus is saying makes me want to defend what the position that they're in now. I mean, how can these people be acting like such dictators while they have really no authority? They're decimated. Their authority has been decimated. They don't have a security apparatus, and they don't have a political establishment that's worthy of any respect over there. So how can they be imposing their will so deeply that nobody can dare publish or write anything against them? I read what is written against them in the Palestinian press every day, against the Palestinian Authority, with suggestions, serious suggestions for changes of leadership, for reform, for opening up elections, very serious, and accusations of corruption. All that stuff is all over the press in the Palestinian media. So I don't know what this dictatorship when the media is about. But anyway, I do not want to be drawn in again to get this, my position, your position. We must absolutely, responsibly defend that whatever is worth defending by human criteria that applies to all, and not our tribe against their tribe. This is what got us in this mess in the first place. We must transcend those things.
On that note, I must conclude. Thank you so much, Mr. Marcus. Thank you.
Thank
Dr. Asali, thank you for joining us from Washington. Mr. Marcus here.
Thank you very much.
In New York City. As I mentioned, there is a documentary called The Making of a Child Warrior, which is produced by his organization, and the other documentary that has been referred to is called Ask for Death, produced by Mr. Marcus. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Nina Monk is here. Her new book is Fools Rush In, Steve Case, Jerry Levin, and the Unmaking of AOL Time Warner. She's also a contributing editor at Vanity Fair magazine and a freelance magazine journalist. Her work has appeared in Fortune, Forbes, The New Yorker, and the New York Times Magazine. I am pleased to have her at this table. First of all, as we tape this, it's a day that Comcast announced that it was making a run at Disney, as someone said, a mouse hunt. Tell me what you think about that, and do you see any similarities here at all between that and this?
It's an extraordinary moment. I mean, you take, you've got Disney, which is sort of really the king of Hollywood, and you take Comcast, this upstart that was started out of Mississippi in 1963, and making this hostile offer for Disney. It's quite extraordinary. I do see similarities. You see in Michael Eisner, not unlike Gerald Levin, the former CEO of Time Warner, a man who I think above all is really an imperial CEO, as Jerry Levin actually called himself. Michael Eisner in many ways exemplifies the sort of CEO that was very much in favor in the late 1990s, a celebrity CEO, a kind of a demigod, the sort of men and women in certain cases who landed on the cover of Fortune and Forbes all the time and began, I think, to believe their own hype. And I think this hostile bid, while it's certainly going to take a long time to play out, in many ways speaks more to the dangers that Eisner faces right now and the sense of dissatisfaction among shareholders with his performance.
And the sense among other people who might be interested in acquiring Disney that there's blood in the water.
There is certainly blood in the water. There's a feeling, although the stock has recovered somewhat in the last 12 months, it is down sharply from what it once was. Michael Eisner is under tremendous attack from shareholder activists. He has taken in somewhere in the range of $800 million in compensation over the last decade or so, even while his stock has underperformed a U.S. Treasury bill, for example. So he's really a target for people who want to see some sort of shake-up going on at these old-style companies.
Let's talk about this now. One last point. Comcast, I'm sure, would want you to know, and you know, that that's a solid company built on solid earnings, and they've got a lot of hard assets.
Oh, I think it's actually an extraordinary company.
It's probably the best-run cable company in the world, and they have shown
they're great
they
managers.
know how to manage. Exactly.
I'll tell you one thing, though. It's still a family-run company. It's a public company. It's a public company, of course, officially.
Because of the nature of the voting stock.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Let me move to Jerry Levin, the most intriguing character in your book by a wide margin. Tell me about it.
You're absolutely right. I mean, to my mind, of all the CEOs I've written about over the years, and there have been many, Jerry Levin was the most fascinating character. And I trailed him for a long time before even getting around to writing this book, and he wouldn't speak to me, and finally, sort of gave in, I guess you might say, and I spent an inordinate amount of time with him. I think what I find so interesting about Jerry Levin is that he's a man of such extreme contradictions. A man who, on one hand, clearly is an intellectual, clearly is not like your typical mogul. A man who does not care about money. I think he makes that absolutely clear. A man who is not driven by the sorts of things that one understands CEOs to be driven by.
Which is yachts and big houses and those kind of things,
Precisely.
Or power, per se?
I think power certainly motivated him, but I think more the outward symbols of power, the yachts and the big houses.
He had no interest in that.
He was very understated. He was a man who did not frequently allow himself to be interviewed by the media, for example. He was a man who quoted the Bible with great ease. Who quoted French philosophers. Albert Camus he often referenced as a great influence of his, Greek philosophers, and on and on. And yet, at the same time, this is a man who, without question, is one of the most ruthless and Machiavellian men in U.S. corporate history. And to see that you can be both those people at once is extraordinary to me. And I think one of Jerry Levin's great strengths, and the reason he remained in power for as long as he did, is that he threw people off. People are not accustomed to that kind of contradiction. They expect someone, we're accustomed to the black and the white. Is he a Machiavellian backstabber? Yeah. Or is he this pious, Bible-quoting Greek philosopher?
And your answer is he is both.
He is both.
Yeah. What is interesting is that at the time of this merger, which was what? What was the day? It was right at the top of the market.
The merger was announced on January the 10th, 2000, which was exactly 2.5 months before Internet stocks peaked, and of course, very quickly then began their collapse.
At that time, the market value of AOL was?
Twice as much as Time Warner's. It was $170 billion, an extraordinary number, a number that just doesn't make any sense at all today. You know, you think about it, here was AOL, and you know, it was only 4 years ago, and yet it seems an eternity ago. Here was AOL, a company that was only 15 years old, that had a single product, dial-up internet access, a CEO who was only 39 years old, i.e. Steve Case, and yet here it was, able to buy Time Warner in the biggest merger ever for $165 billion, a company that dated back to 1923 when the first issue of Time
magazine. Greatest collection of magazines, a cable company, a movie company.
Great cash flow. Yeah. You know, AOL had revenues of only $5 billion.
But there were no people when this happened, or few, who were saying this is the stupidest deal Jerry Levin could ever make. Were they? Were there a lot of disclaimers at the time?
No, there were very few. I mean, this is of course, you sit here now and we speak with the clarity of hindsight, and it's so easy to say, well, of course, this was idiotic. You know, we were caught up in a mania, and there was a frenzy, and I think even among those who were cynics and those of us who said, well, there's something is wrong here, it doesn't make sense when AOL is worth that much more, we still fundamentally believe the world had changed.
And that Jerry Levin saw the future and had acted on it.
Jerry Levin saw the future and had acted on it. I think he did something that was very bold, or at least appeared to be very bold at the moment. What we realized later was that...
He gave up his company.
Well, there was that. He had done it for the wrong reasons. He had done it, as you see happens so often with imperial CEOs, where they do things not, in fact, for their shareholders. They do things to serve their own vanity, to serve their own ego. And the great sadness here is that you realize really that this is what propelled the deal.
The ego of Jerry Levin.
The ego of Jerry Levin, the
and
desire
Steve Case too, but Levin was the one who was in the position to say, no, your company, no matter what the market value, is not worth what you're willing to pay for my company.
Absolutely. And let me just tell you this too. Even if you say, you know what, you can't expect Jerry Levin to have understood how inflated Internet stocks were. I mean, most of us didn't at the time. Even if you say forget about that, you have to understand it, and I think it becomes very clear when you read my book, that this was a deal that was so clearly doomed long before it was announced. And what makes it even worse is that although the deal was announced in early 2000, Internet stocks started to collapse only 3 months later. It took 12 months for regulators to finalize the deal and give their seal of approval.
Right.
In those 12 months, Jerry Levin could have called off that deal. And as my book states very clearly, any number of his most senior executives, all of them, at some point told Jerry Levin, call this deal off.
They all did.
They all did.
After months or several months.
Absolutely.
Between the time they announced the deal.
It became clear.
And why did he not do it?
Well, this is very interesting. Now, when I asked him just that question, he sort of gave me two reasons. One is he claimed that none of his executives had told him that, which speaks a lot to the sort of delusion, I think, that Jerry Levin has found himself in, but that's a different issue. I think he felt really that this was the crowning moment of his career, and he had gone so far down the path, and it's so difficult for men and for CEOs especially, once they get to that point, to stand up and say, I was wrong, I'm going to pull the plug.
The idea that he'd built the greatest media company ever with one foot in the past and one foot in the future.
He was 60 years old, 61 years old by the time the deal closed. He felt this was going to be his great legacy.
The only executive that survived is Dick Parsons, now chairman and CEO of Time Warner. How was it he survived?
He's a brilliant politician, an extraordinary diplomat, a man who spent many years in Washington, whose background, in fact, is in politics. At the same time, I think one of the points I make in my book is that he's also someone who both sides